As the students are settling, I want to say a special welcome. My name is Professor McGill and I'm chair of the conference committee. Our doctoral students are assisting with the ushering and looking after the various bits and pieces. Welcome all the students who have come for this session. Again, welcome to our streaming community globally. All our presentations are streamed live throughout the world to the various Spiritan communities in some schools and other places. So welcome all the streaming community globally. A special welcome to the students for this presentation. And also I want to say a word of welcome to our Irish contingent in this table over here. If you guys could stand up, please. So we welcome the high school students from Ireland. They will be presenting at lunchtime, and you'll hear more about that in a moment. If I could ask Central Catholic School to stand up so we can welcome you again. Thank you all. It's lovely to see you. So these are two high school groups that have been working with us on the IOC conference on sustainability and ecological environmental issues, which is great. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. If the students at the back, if you can move all the way down this wall, if you haven't got a seat, or move all the way along the back here, that's great. Andrew, if you and our doctoral students, if you could usher people all the way along this wall, we're going to need more space. We don't want a crowd at the door. That's a safety issue. Okay? So no one standing in the doorway, please. Everyone has to be ushered. This is a good sign that we've got lots of people wanting to hear this presentation. We have seats at some of these tables. So it's really important that there's no group of students at the doorway. That's a real safety fire regulation issue. Gloria, if you could manage that, please, to make sure everyone is ushered along the walls. And anyone standing, there are some empty seats at tables. If you want to come and take any of them, please feel free. It's going to be a long stand otherwise for you. All right. So it's my pleasure to introduce this session. And to do so, I'm asking Professor Anna Scheid from Theology to come forward to make the introduction.
Good morning. If you're just arriving, welcome to the Integrity of Creation Conference here at Duquesne University. It's my pleasure to introduce you to our next plenary presenter, Dr. Cynthia Lobeda. Dr. Lobeda comes to us today from Northern California, where she serves as Professor of Theological and Social Ethics at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, which is part of the Graduate Theological Union. She has published and presented research in a variety of areas, including economic globalization, moral agency, faith-based resistance to systemic injustice, ethical implications of resurrection and incarnation, the Bible and ethics, theoethical method, and climate justice as related to racial and class difference. In her work, she aims to connect earth ethics to liberation theologies with a special emphasis on eco-feminist theology. A prolific writer and sought-after speaker, Dr. Lobeda has authored or co-authored 6 books, including Resisting Structural Evil, Love as Ecological Economic Vocation, and Public Church for the Life of the World, as well as over 50 articles and essays. She has lectured widely in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. And if you're keeping count, yes, that is every continent except Antarctica. A dedicated servant leader in her church and community, Dr. Lobeda was appointed theological consultant to the presiding bishop of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America and has served as a healthcare worker and church worker in Honduras, and as director of the Washington, D.C. office of Augsburg College's Center for Global Education. Closely related to our topic this morning, she recently initiated an interdisciplinary project in public scholarship that examines the moral and policy implications of climate change as a matter of race and class-based climate debt, including climate debt owed by the global north to the global south. Dr. Lobeda, we welcome you to Pittsburgh, we welcome you to Duquesne, and we're eager to hear you speak to us today on the topic of your plenary address, Hope, Radical Love, and Moral Spiritual Power in an Age of Climate Colonialism.
Thank you for the hospitality and the gracious welcome that I have experienced ever since that first email from Dr. Gerald McGill inviting me to join you here, and the careful attention of Glory Smith that has been magnificent. I also am so impressed by the creative impulse in this conference to really involve high school students and university students, as well as such a breadth of disciplinary knowledge. I commend the creativity that has gone into designing this event. You all are fortunate, those of you who are a part of this university. Yeah. Dear friends, we live in a time both terrible and overflowing with potential for the good. Each of you has a key role to play, and it is a role that builds on who you are and the gifts you have been given. One question before launching into this talk. Two questions. How many of you have felt fear, anger, grief, confusion, or deep anxiety about climate change? We share that in common. How many of you understand yourselves to be informed by the values and teachings of a religious or spiritual tradition, be it some form of Christian traditions or Jewish, Muslim, Buddhist, indigenous, or other traditions? Okay. This morning, we will explore the call to love neighbor as self, primarily as it is known in Christianity, but I invite any of you linked to other religious traditions to hear and consider the resonance of this calling as it's articulated in your tradition. I'll share with you three things, and they will be parts 1, 2, and 3 of this address. The first is my understanding of why we exist on this earth. The second is a haunting reality that torments me. And finally, something about where I find hope, including in practical actions. Sound okay to you? It would be terrifying if y'all said no. Well, with that, let us move into part 1, the call to love. What are we human beings called to do in this life on earth? Jesus seems quite clear. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This is the first and great commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus here is drawing upon his own scripture, the Torah, or what Christians know as the First or Old Testament, which calls people to love your neighbor as yourself. Dwell with me this morning in this life-giving summons, this resounding, resilient, pervasive, beckoning, quiet yet thundering calling that is, according to some people, the very heart of the cosmos. Love, as it is revealed in the best of Christianity, as well as Jewish and Muslim teachings, makes claims, love makes claims that shake the foundation of the world. The first, or beginning point, is God's love. The breathtaking claim that God, the creating, liberating, healing source of all that is, loves this world and each one of us with a love that will never cease or diminish, a love more powerful than any force in heaven or earth. Secondly, we human animals are created and called to recognize this gracious love, to receive it, to relish it, and then to trust it. But finally, after receiving and trusting this love, we are to embody it in the world by loving self and others as God loves. We are beckoned to join with God's Spirit, I emphasize Spirit in this community, God's Spirit of justice-making love in its steadfast commitment to gain fullness of life for all. According to widespread understanding of the Christian story, this is the human vocation, your life's work, to receive and trust God's love and live that mysterious and marvelous love into the world by loving neighbor as self. Well, that human beings are called to love is simple enough to say, but what is meant by that tiny and potent word is not. Martin Luther King said it well. Martin Luther King Jr. said it well. I quote, "Our responsibility as Christians is to discover the meaning of this command and seek passionately to live it out in our daily lives." End quote. Love in the biblical sense is a wild idea. The faint of heart beware. Love is not what one finds on a Hallmark card. Yet, we make assumptions about love that domesticate, privatize, truncate, and sentimentalize it. Tell me, throw out a word. What do people think of when they think of loving others? Kindness, empathy, compassion, intimacy, action. These are all elements of love. I would suggest that love also means much more. It does not mean only a feeling of goodwill or generosity. Dangerous questions spring forth from the call to love. Who, to note just one, is my neighbor? Well, my neighbor, in the biblical sense, is whomever my life touches. Given the current realities of climate change and globalization, and as we heard this morning, industrialized agriculture, my neighbor is a global reality. Note three features of neighbor love as a theological norm. First, neighbor love is a steadfast commitment to serve the well-being of whomever is loved. Secondly, Jesus' words are beautifully constructed to presuppose the value of self-respect and self-honoring. You are called to love neighbor as self. Right. The third feature opens a vast, vexing, and vibrant, heart-shaking can of worms. It is this: where systemic injustice causes suffering, seeking the well-being of those who suffer, actively loving, entails seeking to dismantle that injustice. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, how many are familiar with Dietrich Bonhoeffer's names? One of the leaders of the resistance to fascism in Germany. Put it this way, he called this dismantling of structural injustice, He called it putting a spoke in the wheel of unjust power structures. And with this, a bit of fear and trembling makes sense. Systemic or structural injustice, as you know, refers to systems of living that benefit some people while damaging others. They may be economic, ideological, political, or institutional systems. Now listen up. Two characteristics of systemic injustice render it particularly pernicious. One, it generally is not visible to those not suffering from it. So those of us who are white, for example, often don't see the systemic injustice of racism. Secondly, it operates regardless of the moral goodness of the people involved. Do you understand what I'm saying? We're all involved, we're all maybe very moral people seeking to undo environmental damage, but we're all involved in industrialized agriculture, which we heard about this morning. So it's invisible, or tends to be invisible, to those who are not suffering from it. And secondly, it operates regardless of the goodness of the people involved. Slavery in the U.S. was a vivid example. Slavery benefited the slave-owning classes and people who bought cheap cotton at terrible cost to enslaved people. Yet for many slave owners, the injustice of slavery was not visible. They didn't see it as unjust. They thought their way of life was good, and indeed many of them were in other dimensions of their lives moral people. Yet unwittingly they participated, or wittingly, in the terrible systemic sin of slavery. What happens when neighbor love encounters suffering caused by systemic injustice? The response of Christian love to slavery was not simply to bind up the wounds of the slaves. It was to expose, resist, and dismantle the structural sin of slavery. What justice-making neighbor love requires of us is the great moral question permeating Christian history. We, the people in this room, live at an astounding moment in time to take truly seriously this calling. And now we move to part 2 of my comments, a haunting contradiction. I am haunted by the contradiction between this reason for being, to love neighbor as self, and the hidden realities of our collective lives, what some call structural sin. In our minutes together this morning, daring to heed this contradiction draws us into stark and foreboding terrain, a landscape from which I, for one, would rather flee. But hear me well, we will not stay in that stark terrain. We will move from it into life-giving hope. So step with courage to look briefly at the unprecedented crisis now facing the generations of people gathered here as a consequence of our collective lives. The human species, or rather the high-consuming among us, has through climate change become a menace to life on Earth. Earth cannot continue to sustain life as we live it. Our consumptive use of Earth's resources is rapidly destroying the life support systems upon which our lives depend. As Dr. Angelo noted this morning, the credible scientific community is of one accord about this basic reality and has known about it for decades. Less widely accepted, in U.S. society at least, is a corollary point of soul-searing moral import. It is this, and I thank Dr. Angelo for making this point very clearly. In general, the people most devastated by climate change are not causing it. The race and class dimensions of this injustice are stark, caused overwhelmingly by the world's high-consuming societies and people. Climate change is wreaking death and destruction first and foremost on impoverished people who are also disproportionately people of color. The island nations that will be rendered unlivable by rising seas, subsistence farmers whose crops are lost, coastal people without resources to protect against and recover from climate-related weather disasters are not largely responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, nor are they, for the most part, white. Some time ago, I was invited to India to work with the church and seminary leaders on matters of eco-justice. There, I learned that the nearly 25 million people already displaced by climate change, I learned of the 25 million people already displaced. The church in India gently taught me to re-see climate change as climate colonialism. Climate change, declared one Indian church leader, I quote, is caused by the colonization of the atmospheric commons. The powerful nations and the powerful within them continue to emit greenhouse gases beyond the capacity of the planet to withstand. However, the communities with almost zero footprint bear the brunt of the consequences, end quote. Their teaching has never left me, and I've been seeing climate colonialism as the paradigm through which to see climate change ever since. To illustrate, countless reports, as we heard this morning, link climate change to hunger. How many of you are familiar with Oxfam? Oxfam, one of the great development agencies. Oxfam's report, Climate Change versus Food Security, declares, I quote, one of climate change's most savage impacts on humanity will be increased hunger. Folks, let it sink in. With global warming, dry places become drier, wet places wetter. With drought, if free market rules govern food prices, the poorest starve. Add to this the rising seas that could threaten more than a quarter of Africa's people and drown some island states. This means hundreds of millions of climate refugees, largely people of color. Within the U.S., too, economically marginalized people, who are also disproportionately people of color, are most vulnerable to the extreme storms, illness, and food insecurity brought on by climate change. In Oakland, the town right beside my city in California, the city's studies report that 3,000 to 5,000 residents live in areas that will be flooded due to climate change. 90% of them are low-income, non-white, or non-English speaking. Environmental racism and white privilege strike again in climate change. Look, the catalog of climate change damage to the world's already vulnerable people will blow your mind. Yet, the cause of this disaster is the uncontrolled burning of fossil fuels, especially by high-consuming societies, and that, dear friends, is us. Truth-telling reveals the unbearable. Just by housing, feeding, clothing, transporting ourselves, we are cutting down the life chances of many. By doing nothing or little, we actively bring on the catastrophe. Do not think for a moment that the people of Africa, Asia, Europe, and Latin America are not fully aware of the role that we play. Many voices of the Global South recognize this as climate debt. But wait, danger lurks. Facing realities such as these breeds despair and powerlessness. To acknowledge the widespread suffering linked to my material abundance would be tormenting. How could I live with the knowledge if I truly took it in? And if I dare to see, then I view also the power and complexity of structural injustice. Where would I find the moral, spiritual power to transgress tidal waves of political and economic and cultural forces lined up to maintain these complex systems? A sense of inevitability may suck away at hope. Have any of you felt that sense of inevitability? Yeah. I speak about that very, very personally and from the heart. As a young person, I first learned about structural injustice with my church youth group. I saw a film that exposed the tremendous damage and harm to people in Central America and some of the Caribbean islands produced by US-based corporations that were creating our food, especially sugar and fruit. I began to learn more about structural injustice. I began to be involved in action. I became irate with the church for not doing more. By the time I left high school, I was deeply discouraged by what I felt was impenetrable systems of injustice. To make a long story short, I fell into despair. I'll say more later about how the Spirit helped lift me from that despair. But the point here is to convey that I know viscerally the despair that can come from looking honestly at structural sin and our engulfment in it. So with that, I'd like to move on to part 3, hope and moral courage for a hurting world. How then shall we live? Wherein lies the moral, spiritual courage to face the truth and not run from it, the vision and wisdom to repent and change direction? Wherein lies the moral, spiritual power to embody justice-seeking neighbor love in our world today? Now this is crucial. Alternative justice-making responses to the climate catastrophe are utterly possible. The crisis could catalyze more equitable, democratic, and compassionate ways of living and organizing our society. At this, the testing point in human history, something new is asked of humankind. It is to forge ways of living that serve and protect Garden Earth, and do so in ways that build justice within and between societies. Where something new is asked of humankind, something new is asked of the university and of the church. If religion has any calling, and it does, it is one to insist with prophetic fervor and fierce love that our societal response to the climate crisis serves the good of the vulnerable rather than contributing to further climate injustice. And we can talk about ways in which mitigation and efforts can damage the vulnerable. Secondly, the role of the church to plumb the depths of our traditions for wellsprings of moral, spiritual vision, hope, courage, and practical strategies toward more equitable and ecologically sustainable ways of living. And third, to bring these resources to the broader public. One of these resources is the firm insistence and promise that life is to be guided primarily by God's gift of justice-seeking neighbor love. That is a love which, as we noted earlier, seeks to dismantle unjust systems that cause suffering, including the economic, political, and cultural systems that generate our high-consuming, climate-devastating ways of life. And what of the university? All fields of human inquiry, every field taught at this university, must step up to the plate. The natural sciences, social sciences, humanities, fine arts, legal studies, health fields, communication studies, all fields. It falls to the university, its students, staff, faculty, administration, to rally the gifts of the human intellect for meeting the greatest challenge ever to face this species, reversing a deadly dash to climate disaster, and instead forging ways of living that allow Earth to flourish and all people to have the necessities for life with dignity. The cognitive abilities of this brilliant, creative, and dangerous species are astounding. Do not allow them to be wasted at this crucible point in human history. Religious traditions and the historic role of the university in modern life are replete with ingredients of hope and moral courage necessary for radical movement from the way things are toward the way things could and ought be. What then are some of those ingredients or seeds of moral spiritual power to be found in religion and in the university at their best? Well, both throughout the ages have offered, one, a vision of how life, including economic life, should be lived, and two, practices for getting there. We consider now both the vision and the practical steps briefly. Moral vision. Viable response to a problem depends upon what the problem is understood to be. Inadequate analysis leads to inadequate diagnosis and remedies. Hence the utter necessity of seeing clearly what is going on in the climate crisis and climate injustice. To that end, note that the climate disaster is inseparably linked to the global economy as we know it today. While we have not time to probe that length in depth, a few facets reveal much. The economic order that we assume as a given, advanced global capitalism, will not continue long into the future. I say this not in the first place as a political or moral opinion. It is a statement about physical reality. And this point is central. Earth, as a biophysical system, cannot continue to sustain economic life as we know it. This form of economy requires and presupposes, one, growth at almost any cost, understood as both necessary and good. Two, freedom to maximize profit understood as a human right, including profit from environmentally devastating and humanly cruel practices. Three, this form of economy requires or presupposes a societal consumption orgy fueled by a brilliantly creative and strategic advertising industry that convinces people to fill life with stuff. Imagine the massive CO2 emissions entailed in the production, transport, and disposal of our stuff around the globe. Four, this economy requires spreading that consumption orgy around the globe to ensure markets. We can read 1943 classified documents stating the grand arena that the U.S. had to control economically in order to maintain markets for the growing consumption economy. So the physical problem is that Earth does not possess the unlimited goods and services, such as climate regulation and fresh water, to continue with these economic rules. To illustrate, if we burn the fossil fuels necessary to maximize growth, profit, and consumption, the climate will warm too much for the human civilization. Carrying on indefinitely with economic life as we know it is not physically possible because it destroys a necessary condition for life, a livable climate. The future holds different economic rules. I am not saying that profit and growth are bad, only that they need be subservient to human well-being and Earth's well-being. Nor am I taking a stand against business. I am taking a firm stand for business that is not compelled to maximize profit and does not have the rights of a citizen, and business that is accountable to a triple bottom line. And I understand the triple bottom line of financial, social, and ecological. And mine is an appeal to business to become an active force for economic justice and ecological restoration. What I began to learn about your university yesterday evening is that there is tremendous orientation that way in, what is it, a master's in sustainable business? What's the title of it? Masters of Sustainable Business Practices. So I imagine here the students, like many students in Europe, are studying triple bottom line, et cetera. So I was thrilled to hear what I heard yesterday evening about movement in that direction here at this university. Well, I am not talking about impossible ideals because, and please do not forget this, it may be the most important of my comments. Economic systems are constructed by human decisions and actions, and therefore they can be reconstructed. So again, the future holds different economic rules. That is the physical issue. We return now to the matter of religious faith and higher education, and they bring good news indeed. While humans have no choice whether economic life will change, humans will determine in what direction it changes. And herein lies an invaluable role of religion and of the university. The world's great spiritual traditions all hold a vastly different understanding of the purpose of human life than maximizing consumption and profit. Some articulate that purpose as loving neighbor as self. Some articulate it as compassion, as does the Buddhist tradition, and so forth. But all contradict the claim that life and the institutions that organize it are to revolve around or condone maximizing profit and consumption at all costs. Religious traditions can and must insist vocally and politically on economic rules of the game that uphold the common good with its twin arms, as was made so profoundly clear by Pope Francis in the encyclical, the twin arms of social justice and Earth's well-being. No one has made that calling of religion clearer than has the current Pope. And no one has made more closely intertwining social justice and ecological well-being. The university, too, at its best, has fomented vision for the great movements toward equitable and compassionate ways of life. Consider the potential of the university faculty and students to generate interdisciplinary vision for the great turn toward climate justice. That is, I think, part of your purpose in this conference. Indeed, vision of a moral economy is one vital vision of a moral economy, is one vital ingredient of hope and moral courage in the face of climate catastrophe. A second ingredient is the amazing practical work that is being done by groups of people around the world today to realize such a vision. To a huge extent, this is not the work of individuals alone. It is the action of people working collectively. I was at the UN representing the World Council of Churches at the a huge sustainability conference. And I remember seeing hundreds of small booths of nonprofit organizations out on the vast yard area. And they all represented different groups aimed at building economic, racial, and ecological justice. This is also, in this great movement, is where you are players in the story. We must live differently, consume far less, convert our energy use to renewables, eat far less industrially produced food that is shipped from distant shores. However, this does not mean change only at the lifestyle or household level. It means change in all arenas of social organization. By this I mean 5 arenas. One is household and lifestyle. A second is institutions. Imagine the university having vastly lowered its carbon footprint. The energy sources are solar and wind. The energy is used efficiently and you use less of it. You no longer use any plastic or paper cups, plates, or utensils, and your food service uses locally produced low-meat food. A third arena or level is the level of the corporation and other businesses. How many of you are going into business? Imagine 5 years from now, your business has made a commitment to a triple bottom line. Success is measured not only by financial well-being, but ecological and social contributions. A fourth level is public policy or government. What are the public policies, tax policies, farm subsidy policies, farm subsidy bill, the Farm Bill, as we heard earlier this morning, research and development policies, investment decisions, zoning decisions, public policies that will enable Pittsburgh and this state and this country to become carbon neutral in short order and protect the most vulnerable people in that change. The fifth level is worldview or consciousness. I am moved beyond words by the veritable miracle of movement toward ecological well-being and economic justice at all 5 of those levels that is afoot in our world today. Religious communities and universities are driving forces. However, this movement is not well known. Many people feel powerless because they do not know a path forward. Therefore, it is so vital to be discovering and walking those paths forward. By exercising one's own power in walking those paths, we empower others. So let's get a little more specific. Change at these levels is happening through many forms of action. I often refer to these forms of action as currents in the great river flowing toward and watering the new and life-giving ways of living together on earth. Imagine a few of these streams. One is lifestyle change, as we noted before. A second is legislative advocacy. Some cities, for instance, are passing laws to ban the sale of water bottles. Might political science classes here have projects that prepare students for public policy advocacy that moves toward climate neutrality? A third form of action is education and consciousness raising. How about if an economics class taught students to read the total cost of a product rather than only the monetary price affixed to it? How many gallons of water and how much greenhouse gas is emitted to produce a bottle of Coke or a pound of meat? A fourth level of action is economic advocacy. This means many things. Socially and ecologically responsible investing, aimed at moving business to serving the common good. A fifth level of action is related to economic advocacy, and that is starting and building alternative economic and agricultural systems and practices, such as co-ops, worker-owned businesses, municipally owned services such as cable, telephone, and internet, local or regional investment banks, community-supported agriculture, urban agriculture, farmers markets. And a sixth form of action is worship practices and theology. Since the earliest centuries of the church, liturgy has been meant in part to shape or form people for faithful living. Now, that includes crafting earth-honoring liturgies and theologies that help us to reform how we live so that our everyday lives reflect God's love for creation. These then, lifestyle change, legislative advocacy, education and consciousness raising, economic advocacy, economic and agricultural alternatives, and worship are all forms of action or streams in the practice of climate justice. So, in closing, humankind hovers on a precipice. One side is the current path toward almost unimaginable climate disaster, in which those least responsible for climate change suffer first and foremost its consequences. The other side, however, is the potential before us, the vision that we all hold in varied forms of a world in which all people have the necessities for life with justice and joy, and Earth's fragile life systems on which our lives depend can flourish. A great choice, a great calling is before us. It requires radical change at all levels of being. Will we step up to the plate? Will we accept the call to love neighbor in our day? Or will we flee into the haunts of half-baked commitment, denial, despair, or privatized morality? The task of the university and the task of religion in the early 21st century is to plumb the depths of our traditions and our fields of knowledge for wisdom, moral courage, and hope, to meet the great moral challenge of our time in history. Both religious wisdom and university-based knowledge, at their best, are in the service of life and hope. That word of hope comes in many forms. One is the conviction that God loves this world with a healing and liberating love that cannot be stopped. It is humankind's blessed calling to live that love into the world. That means facing the reality of what we are doing to Earth and its vulnerable people through climate change, and then, with moral courage and hope, changing direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for such a lovely presentation, Professor Lobeda. So there's a little exchange of students again moving to class, and we'll just take a second or two to have a breather. My own doctoral students are handing out to the audience now another forum. The graduate students should be distributing them. Can you see these forms? Somebody should be distributing forms. Glory, give them to a bundle of students and let the students distribute them, please. Graduate students, if you could go over and get these forms, you've got copies over here. We need more students to distribute the forms. All the graduate students should be distributing forms, even those holding microphones. It'll only take a second or two for these forms because this is part of our conversation. And I think it's settling now. The time of class exchange has gone. All right. So it's my pleasure now to have the discussion part of this session and to introduce, to begin the discussion, let me introduce Professor Elizabeth Vasco from Theology. And Elizabeth, would you like to come forward and take the microphone? Okay. Whoops.
Thank you. So my goal here is really to facilitate the conversation and let you talk. And what we thought we would do is give you a chance to reflect and ingest, since we've heard a lot of rich thoughts, is if you could turn to the people at your tables just for a minute or two and share a couple of things that struck you the most deeply. So what resonated with you from Dr. Mo Lobeda's reflections in terms of ecological justice? So what resonated with you the most deeply? Thank you. Okay, if you could wrap up your reflections. We hate to cut off the lively discussions at the table, but I did want to allow a little bit of time for large group discussion and for some questions. So if you have any questions, our graduate students will be rotating with the microphones. If you could just raise your hands.
I dominated the conversation here. Can you hear me now? I sort of monopolized the conversation because I was left feeling very uncomfortable that I could not shake out the thought saying that if your first principle, or the first part of the talk was focused on love and you challenged the evangelical community to focus on love their neighbor, I could not reconcile that with the actual activities on the ground. That a predominant portion of the evangelical community is anti-science.
Is
They
what?
Don't believe in climate change.
Yeah.
Don't believe in allowing responsible migration or help.
Right.
Sort of everything that you said that a good evangelical or a Christian or a faith-based person should hold
Right.
seems to go against everything that I see in the news.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yes, it's what you're saying is very, very real. That, and in essence, that's what I was talking about when I said a contradiction that haunts. Because on the most explicit level, yes, it is very evident that many parts of the faith community, and here we'll just say the Christian faith community, are denying climate change and are going forward as though it doesn't matter at all. So on that explicit level, that's very, very real. On another level, we're all guilty of the same, because we're not guilty of denying, but we're guilty of living lives that continue to support and further climate change. So there are many ways to think about that. One is to name the fact that on the one hand, human beings will always be imperfect and not live up fully to the call to love. However, we are called to live it as fully as we can. And that means naming and changing the parts of our lives that are antithetical to, and in this case, naming and changing the complicity with ways of life that produce climate change. So you mentioned the evangelical community, and that word means many different things, but if we use it in its most common term, it means the evangelical parts of Christianity in the United States that are often very conservatively to the far right also. I will say that the evangelical community is highly varied. It's not monolithic, and I learned that because I needed to dig more deeply into that. And there are many parts of the evangelical community that are in fact taking climate change seriously, and there's tremendous hope in that. There is a book that came out probably 10 years ago, edited by someone named T.J. Berry, B-E-R-R-Y, called Care of Creation. And it's a compilation of evangelical theologians and scientists all looking and calling deeply for the care of creation. And there was a statement that came out more than 10 years ago, the Evangelical Declaration on Care of Creation. So there are voices within that, and there are a number of evangelical seminaries that are actually taking up creation care as a theme. So I would say I do see signs of that even in the parts of Christian traditions, the evangelical community, that have been the last to come on board. We see then within more mainline Protestantism and in the Roman Catholic community in the U.S., actually, although it's taken so long to come on board and it's not adequate, we see a lot of strong movement There are a number of seminaries now that are becoming environmentally certified. One of them is my seminary. There are seminaries with study programs. We now have a concentration in climate justice at the seminary at which I teach. The Pope's statement has had a tremendous impact on the teaching of theology and on church communities and ecclesial bodies coming to take seriously. There is more leadership from the church in other parts of the world. I was in the Pacific, of course, some of the Jesuit statements coming out of the Pacific. I was really so moved when I was in India, as I mentioned before, when I got to the site that I was going to for work with seminary professors. I was called there because 40 different seminaries affiliated with a particular university have a climate justice and environmental justice requirement in the seminary curriculum. And as I got to the conference site, there was this group of people leaving, and they had that look of kind of exhausted but accomplished, like when you've really gotten something done. And it turns out it was the Sunday school leadership of administration of Sunday school throughout all of northern India, who had just designed an eco-justice Sunday school curriculum. And I thought, wow. And this was 5 or 6 years ago. My church hasn't designed for the nation an eco-justice Sunday school curriculum. So I think movement is happening in the church, in various parts of the church. And by that I would mean the Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, and the Protestant, and also the evangelical community that kind of moves throughout all of those. There is movement forward, but it's taking time. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for your talk. At our table, if I could just say two things that came up. One is sort of institutional instability as everybody tries to change things, and the good and the anxiety that goes along with that. And the other thing was that nature, going and taking students into nature, taking children into nature, so my question comes out of the second one. You know, justice obviously can't just be stewardship and for the purposes of human justice. It has to be justice, a sense of duties to, rights of our other living things. And so I wanted you to talk a little bit about that, because a lot of what you were talking about was loving one's neighbor, but I want the children to love the birds, and
Yes.
my institution of my backyard is currently in crisis because I'm loving my weeds, and I don't really know which ones to pluck and which ones are good for the butterflies, but that's a good crisis, even though my neighbors actually hate me for it. Because the watershed is better because it's just going into the weeds. But anyways, I'm just saying I'm sort of lost and looking maybe for a little guidance with regard to eco-justice that isn't human to human.
Yes. Yeah, very, very, very important question. My talk was emphasizing the human to human, partly because people come at this from different perspectives. And I've been in some communities that really do emphasize care of and love for the other than human parts of nature and not the human, and so I was focusing more on that. I'll say one thing experientially and one thing theoretically. Theoretically, the term climate debt and the work related to climate debt really refers to 3 kinds of debt. And one of those is the one I was talking about, intragenerational, the debt that we owe, that the high-consuming world owes to the more vulnerable world right now. The second is intergenerational, the debt that my generation owes to yours, and the debt including that your generation is going to owe to the next. So the problem of creating a world in which generations to come can't live in. But the third is interspecies, the debt that we owe to the other than human world, and how do we think about that? A comment on the more experiential level, I really do feel that love for, or one not even needs to say love, deep affinity and caring and connection to the other than human world is vitally important for its well-being and for ours. I know how much I value that because I now have a little grandchild. And of all the things I can give him, I have 2 little grandchildren. But one I've had for a couple more years than the other one, so I've been able to teach him more. And I long to give my love for the trees and the mountains. I long for this child to have that love. And I think that one of the things that we can do is model delight in and love for the other than human world. So you're modeling, even your confusion about your weeds is modeling some kind of profound delight in the other than human world, that we've categorized this as a weed, but maybe it's a form of beauty that we just have seen as a weed. I was teaching my little one about the glorious reality of pine cones and how they create trees. You know, they fall and the seeds pop out, and how they create seeds. And I learned from my son after my last visit. My son asked little Eric, "What was your favorite part of Grandma's visit?" And he said, "Oh, Papa, the pine cones." So it's clear to me from my own experience how important it is that we re-understand ourselves as animals on this earth and part of a stunningly, incredibly marvelous creation that we are called to relish and then live as a part of, not apart from. Yeah. So I affirm your confusion about your weeds.
I'd like to thank you for 2 things. First, for introducing me to the idea of climate colonialism, and also for your recognition of the power of religion to shape society and to move forward solutions to this crisis. I come from the Roman Catholic tradition, and recently the Leadership Conference of Women Religious adopted a resolution to examine the intersection of racism, migration, and climate change. And the more I'm looking at those issues, the more I'm starting to wonder if it's not so much an intersection as a causation, where racism is pushing climate change and both of them are pushing forced migration. Would you be able to speak a little bit on that, or do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful resolution that the Leadership Conference of Women Religious passed. And I think that your instincts are smack on. I think racism is pushing climate change. Racism takes so many different forms, and it includes unacknowledged presuppositions of the superiority and greater value of white people. So that's a reality of a society, and in many places a world that's constructed around white supremacy, unacknowledged. And that's very hard to name and admit as a white person, but I'm utterly convinced that it's real. And one of the ways in which that is related to climate change, I think, is that we would not be considering the acceptability of a 2-degree rise as acceptable if it was well-moneyed white people that were going to be dead with a 2-degree rise. We would not be considering, it would not be as acceptable that drought and climate-related famine and migration are all over the place if those people not eating and having to leave their communities were us. We're white people. We're Europeans or North Americans. I think the devaluing of people who are not white is part of what has made us continue to not be aghast at what we are doing. So yes, one of the challenges before us as a society is really to face the inherent white superiority that shapes our society, to face it not with shame and blame, not with that makes us horrible people, not in any way like that. I'm not suggesting blaming and shaming, I'm suggesting naming reality for the sake of countering it. So your inquiry there is important, and I find great hope actually in the intersection of these issues. I find tremendous hope in the fact that people seeking economic justice are realizing that climate and environment are integral. And people seeking racial justice are seeing that. And people seeking, finally, and we've often said that the environmental movement is white. It's not white. It's only white if you define it in a certain way. But around the globe, people seeking climate justice are not predominantly white. So we have a tremendous asset in the fact that different movements for justice are coming together, and all of them are recognizing that we need to move out of a fossil fuel-based extractive and exploitive economy. Yeah, very good question. Yeah, please.
Oh,
I think we need a mic right here.
yes, a question here.
Oh, I'm sorry, there
Good
are two,
morning.
okay.
Yes.
Okay, one in the back and then one right here. Okay, good.
All right. My name is Dr. Lai from Botswana, Africa. And I'm so excited to listen to you, and especially the concept of love. I was thinking about it deeply, especially relating to the issues of Africa. Now, we experience right now, or maybe at this juncture, what we would call a scramble for Africa for the second time, where we see the powerful countries, I will not name them, but the powerful countries coming to Africa, destroying the environment, killing animals, infiltrating guns, we kill ourselves, we destroy ourselves, we remain hungry. And I wonder marvelously, the question of human love, that how much do we love one another in such a way that we would see the betterment of another human being. I think this is what touched me most, because I felt that South Africa has been struggling for a long period of time because of another human being who has been causing pain and pain, and especially the most powerful countries in the world. What advice would you give us as Africans, especially to be resilient and to know how maybe to take care of ourselves? Because recently in South Africa, for instance, we are experiencing what we call self-hate, where Africans kill one another, while the have or the powerful are enjoying themselves, and seeing this calamity happening. So I want to ask you, what advice will you give, especially relating to what you raised on environmental racism and climate colonization? I want you to give advice to us as Africans. How can we love one another? How can we resist the hate that we experience from these big nations? Thank you.
Well, my friend, you ask a huge and important question, and I honor your question. I'm humbled by your question. My first response is that my guess is that the wisdom to answer that comes from Africa, not from me. That is my deepest response, that fellow Africans struggling with that have much more powerful wisdom than have I to give, to respond to you. But I do think that the self-hate that you're talking about is imposed by, as you said, the scramble for Africa and the forces, the countries and the companies that are coming to once again exploit and extract. So it would seem to me that my responsibility is to look at the extent to which my country and companies of my country are involved in that and work against that. The concept of love that you so rightly brought up, as I said, does not have to do primarily with a feeling of goodwill. It has primarily to do with how we act. And it does seem to me that many people involved in systems that are doing that kind of exploitation and extraction in personal life love people. In personal life might be very, very good. And so part of the job in response to the kind of exploitation you're talking about to me is that we must teach, because many people are also involved with religion, we must teach that this love is not met just through personal, interpersonal goodness or good feeling. It's meant to shape every dimension of life, including how the political and the economic. So the church can teach that kind of exploitation and scramble and dissemination of guns and destruction of environment is the antithesis of everything religion teaches or the best of religion teaches about love. So a role of the church can be to teach that is sin, literally sin, and then to help form people to live otherwise.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, there was a question right here that I wanted
Yeah, so last question.
Okay, good.
I hate to be the last question because of what I'm going to say. First of all, I appreciate your talk and I agree 100% with what you're saying. However, I also appreciate this young man's comment. I also have hope because I believe in God. I think you've suggested in many ways in which, and people in this room, many have hope as well and are trying to do things. I'm going to call you a prophet. There are a lot of prophets about the climate, and I'm not particularly one of them, but nevertheless. But I think as I look back over my life, I've seen change, and it's been helpful and it's moved the ball forward. In terms of the climate, they're saying we got 10 years, 15 years, these bright lights are not going to do it in 10 or 15 years. The physicists tell us we're in the beginning of evolution. We've got billions of years to go, maybe, unless it ends all now. But the way I see this whole thing is that progress has come only through suffering. The church grew through suffering. The racism has not been cured in the United States by any means, but it made progress through suffering. People on the streets, people dying. The women's movement has come through suffering. the places that we look to for hope are really part of the problem. The structural sin that you're talking about is probably not within the power of human beings, but maybe it is. I don't know for sure. And the whole history of God's dealing with people has been that there's going to be suffering, and I'm afraid there's going to be a remnant. I mean, we've seen remnants all through history, and you know, we may have to start over again. So that's all I'm saying. I see there's hope, but like I have hope in God. I don't really have hope in these institutions and the ability to change these institutions without a lot of suffering, and that means, you know, some real quick action.
Okay. Okay, well, you've said so much. You've said a great deal, and I am going to think about how to respond in short order here. Let me say that, yes, progress comes through suffering, but there's no need for us to, that doesn't mean to glorify or accept or not try to alleviate suffering. Suffering is part of human life, and suffering is wrought by structural sins. So I would never accept horrors on earth as okay because they create suffering, which will then create progress. But I do understand fully that suffering can result in progress. I understand that our job is to in part alleviate the tremendous suffering that is happening because of climate change. Hope. Yes, you say 10 to 15 years, and maybe it's much less than that. And the facts of the matter around climate change might not produce hope. But the reality is we can live as if we can make a huge difference and minimize the horrors, minimize the consequences of climate change, mitigate and adapt. We can live as if we can, or we can live as if we can't. And I believe that we are all called to choose to live as if we can, and then throw ourselves into that. So I don't put hope as much in the facts of the matter around climate change as I put in the human decision to make a difference and live as if we can. Structural sin, you suggested that's beyond human capacities to address. I will say that human systems can be addressed, and that's part of my purpose. Human systems are created by human beings, and therefore human beings can change them. Part of the form, the reason there's a form that was passed out to you, and we didn't really have time to work with that, but that's okay, is to look at the various ways that people can engage to change systems. So I think that I would, and I know that we need to stop, I would beckon us all to live toward what we would say in theological terms, the reign of God, a world in which all people have what they need and earth can flourish, and live as if we can make a huge difference in that direction, not live as if it's hopeless. And secondly, I would say we should remember that any human system is constructed by human beings, and therefore human beings working strategically, collectively, collaboratively, and caringly can change human systems.
Thank you, Professor Lobeda. Thank you very much for a wonderful and inspiring inspiration, and Professor Vasco for leading us in thoughtful deliberation and conversation. So what we're now doing, we have a fast turnaround over our lunch period because our Irish contingent are about to give us a lovely lunch presentation. So I would ask you to go out here and pick up your lunch at the buffet table and come back in straight away to your seat, and we'll have lunch here, and then we're having a working lunch. So Father Tony, if you would like to go out and lead the Spiritans out this way to get lunch, and everyone else just go out this way. It's a two-sided table, so pick up your buffet and bring your lunch back in here for the next session. Thank you all.